Welcome to MIT's Starr Forum on Syria and the Middle East, What's Next? We're honored to have you with us here today as we're exploring the region and its future with our esteemed speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. I'm Rich Nielsen. I'm an associate professor of political science here at MIT and the faculty director of the MIT Arab World Program at the Center for International Studies. In 2011, revolution sparked in Tunisia, and then Egypt, and then Syria, and other Arab countries throughout the Middle East. In Syria, early optimism about a democratic revolution gave way to a grinding insurgency pitting increasingly Islamist rebels against the brutally repressive regime of Bashar al-Assad, which committed countless atrocities against citizens in its attempts to hang on to power. And it did. So mentally, I had put this revolution in the category of over. And then in November, Syria specialists, who I follow, I am not, though I study the Middle East, started saying something's happening. And just a few weeks later, on December 8th, 2024, the al-Assad regime collapsed as the combined coalition rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham swept into Damascus. To me, this was an emotional moment, honestly. Thousands of Syrian refugees, including those who I'd seen on the streets in Lebanon, sorry, I shouldn't talk about this, were able to return home. And for all the uncertainty that faces Syrians going forward, there are a few things more amazing than a refugee who gets to go home. What a change of events. So with us here today, we have two of Syria's foremost experts to give us some insight into the history, the present, and if I'll push them a little bit, even some guesses about the future for what these changes mean. Before we get started, though, some housekeeping. I'd like to thank the MIT Center for International Studies and the Arab World Program, who are today's sponsors of this event. There's information about these programs at the table near the front. I invite you to learn more and explore opportunities to get involved. We have a list of upcoming events. Hope you'll find some things that are interesting, sign up to receive our mailings, etc. Also want to mention that we'll have Q&A at the end of our talk. We have microphones right here, and so it will help greatly if you can line up behind those microphones. And I will say that at the outset, we will take one question per customer. If we have time, of course, then we will be able to go to more questions. But I just want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask a question first before we're going back. Today's format includes each of the speakers giving a brief talk from the podium of about 15 minutes each. After that, we'll have a conversation amongst the three of us before opening it up for Q&A. And so without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers and turn it over to them. So Marwa Daoudy is an associate professor of international relations at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and the Seif Ghobash Chair in Arab Studies at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. Her research and teaching focus on critical and human security studies, environmental and climate security, climate justice, water politics, negotiation theory, peace negotiations, and Middle East politics. And I'll say that one of the pieces that has impacted me most is her book forced me to rethink an overly simple narrative that drought was the sole factor in the 2000 revolution in Syria. Rana Khoury is an assistant professor of political science and a faculty member at the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Expertise includes comparative international politics with a focus on nonviolent conflict processes, including activism, displacement, and humanitarian response. Her geographic focus is on the Middle East, especially the Levant, and most recently I was influenced by her work on online organizing among Syrian opposition groups which is in part why I'm so excited to have both of them with us today, as they've influenced my thinking and hope will influence yours as well. So Marwa will be first. Please join me in welcoming Marwa Daoudy to the podium.
I put it on. I think it is on, yes. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to Professor Nilsson for inviting me and Ms. English for organizing all this. I'm very pleased to be here today. It's an honor to join you for this discussion. Also, Professor Khoury, as fellow Syrians, we had a lot to discuss just before the event. I just want to say I'll have my talk organized around the interplay between domestic and regional international factors, and to show how the hope that is behind that major change in Syria, and I don't know if we can emphasize enough what a moment of liberation and hope and joy it was on December 8th. I think all of us Syrians thought that there would be a lot of blood spilled on the streets, that it would be a protracted conflict again for the Battle of Damascus. And when the regime collapsed, when Bashar al-Assad fled, it came as a beautiful surprise for all of us. Having said this, there are a lot of challenges, of course, ahead. And I just want to outline, I know I have 15 minutes, so Rich, if I'm too long, please don't hesitate to let me know. There's a lot to discuss, and I think what is important here is the interplay between the different actors, but also the different levels and the different topics. I'll start by the context, just setting up the context, and then moving on to the security landscape, and then the issue of transitional justice, which is very important with the National Dialogue Conference. Economic reconstruction, which is also crucial for all Syrians, and finally, the regional and international relations, considering that the title is Syria, What's Next? The context, of course, we are in the era of the dismantling of the old regime, the Bashar al-Assad, but also the Hafiz al-Assad, the Ba'athist regime. Ahmed al-Shara, the new leader, declared victory on January 29th, his first speech to the nation. There was a lot of frustration for Syrians that he was speaking more to the international community versus to his own constituencies. So he made up with that speech where he declared actually the revolution as victorious, and he also established December 8th as the new national day. There has been an institutional overhaul, and that's the context of what is happening today in that transition period. The dissolution of previous government structures, including the parliament, the Ba'ath Party, the 2012 Constitution, and all exceptional laws were dissolved. And we're talking about the emergency laws, which justified detention, torture, everything, all the tragic history of the last 13, 14 years. There is also, in that context, the potential for a deep state formation, and I'll come to that. By deep state, I mean the dismantling of the Assad-era structure, but also concerned about the newly empowered rulers appointing loyalists, appointing HTS mainly, and potentially taking over. We also know that at the end of January, Ahmed al-Shara appointed himself as the new president, which was also frowned upon by many activists in Syria. Clearly, what matters here for the new regime is to consolidate the security landscape. And we know that Syria is at the crossroads of a lot of conflicts. We know it's in the context of the Gaza genocide, context of the bombardments of Lebanon, the context of Israel expanding within Syria, and I'll come to that, but also internal threats, which are really posing like some risk to the new government, and I will see how actually the new rulers are dealing with those threats. The external and domestic. I'll start with the external threat of what happened on the same day as the fall of the Assad regime. The role of foreign armies, and clearly several armies are occupying still Syria. We know Turkey in the north is still there. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is sponsored by Turkey. It has taken its distance with Turkey in its battle over conquest of Damascus. It's not really a Turkish-led effort. We see it, Syrians see it as very much a Syrian-led success. HTS, and which took a lot of, even Turkey, it seems, by surprise. The most pressing threat at the moment is Israel, its expanded occupation. Israel has taken advantage of the transition to occupy more territory. It's already occupying the Golan Heights, since 1967, but it's expanded over the a so-called buffer zone between Israel and Syria, which was negotiated, by the way, by the American government in 1974, occupying 14 more villages, 35,000 more Syrians under Israeli occupation, and making statements. Netanyahu made statements on Sunday that there will be no withdrawal, and a more recent statement that actually there should be a so-called demilitarized zone because Israel intends to stay in the south of Syria. Taking also, talking about water, capturing, in addition to the upstream sources of the Jordan River, which are Syrian sources, capturing additional sources which account for about 30% of Syria's water resources. And there's been also, as you've read, the bombardment of the Sweda airport, the 500 strikes which completely wiped out Syria's naval, aerial, military capabilities in total violation of international law. So Ahmed al-Sharaa was very cautious in the beginning how to address that threat. He was not mentioning Israel in the first weeks of his rule. And since recently, he has made stronger statements talking about Syria's sovereignty, the need to regain access to legitimate Syrian territory. And actually, the National Dialogue Conference, which opened today and ended today, ended with a statement calling for the withdrawal of Israel and the illegal occupation by Israel. At the same time, the new rulers are not ready to be in a direct confrontation with Israel. Again, the military capabilities have been wiped out, and they have to manage domestic and external threats at the same time. But he has to also cater to his constituencies who consider that expansion as illegal, as a violation of Syrian territory, and also as occupation of land and people. Moving on to the other security landscape issue, which is very important, is the creation of a new national army. And we know that the old army was dissolved when the statement was made at the end of January. The point now, the objective is to include all armed forces. And we know there are many different military groups in Syria. They used to be competing groups. And now they're coming together. And I want to outline that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was the military bloc in charge of the northwest of Syria, the Idlib province, managing it since 2017, civil-military rule. And it's the part of Syria that started, actually, the conquest, the battle for the capture of Damascus. It's been done also in conjunction with the southern groups, the southern military armed groups. And a lot of these armed groups, like Ahrar al-Sham and others, which were under the Syrian National Army, which is the Turkish-backed other military bloc with about 40,000 militants, they have given up and they have integrated already. They have agreed to give up weapons and to integrate the National Army. So that's a major breakthrough already. The other issue here is to have the other groups integrate as well. And I think here the relation with the Syrian Defense Forces, Kurdish-led, US-sponsored, is a point of contention and will be a crucial compass to know how stable and secure the future of the country will be and how integrated Syrian Kurds will be as well. The SDF has about 70,000 militants, and the Syrian Kurds have also carved out an autonomous area, self-proclaimed autonomous area called Rojava, Western Kurdistan, with the de facto assent of Bashar al-Assad, who wanted to put pressure on Turkey, which had taken sides with the revolution. Since then, it's been managed as an autonomous region. And there have been negotiations, a conciliatory tone between the central Damascus government and the Kurdish area. No agreement yet, although there's been mixed signals about some form of consent by the Kurds to integrate the army under certain conditions, to get rid of the foreign fighters, and by these we mean the PKK, Turkish PKK fighters, because the SDF, the PYD in northeast Syria is affiliated with the PKK, and Turkey, of course, in the backside, in the back channel, resisting that agreement. Turkey invaded Syria and has been occupying the north of Syria because in its own vision, it sees that autonomous area as a major threat for Turkish national security, especially that it's affiliated with the PKK. Interestingly, the National Dialogue Conference today, held in Damascus, also ended with a statement proclaiming the new national army and the need for integration of all the military blocs. There is another bloc in the south, which is Russian-sponsored and UAE-sponsored, which is also resisting this integration, which also will need to sort of, might pose like another security threat until there's a sort of integration in one national Syrian army. The security agencies, you know, the famous, infamous, I would say, intelligence services have all been dissolved and replaced by new entities, the old police forces also. And interestingly, just last week, the Syrian Minister of Interior has asked for the return of the police officers and personnel to their work, those who were not involved in massacres, etc. Another element of importance here is the issue of reprisals and sectarian tensions. We know that there's been like about 130 incidents of killings of Assad-related people who were suspected or known to have contributed to the massacres under the Assad era. The situation has been somehow, these are seen as isolated incidents, and it's important to see that 35 people were arrested for having committed those killings, arbitrary killings without any trial or anything. But that might go out of hand if retribution is allowed within the country. And clearly here, there will be a need to balance justice and stability. And also that leads me to my next point about transitional justice and the national dialogue aspect, which is crucial, and even reconciliation. So again, managing accountability versus revenge, there is clearly a lot of grievance, a lot of retribution, 14 years of brutal detention, torture. You mentioned, Rich, 500,000. The refugees, more than 6-7 million, 500,000 have returned to Syria. The rest are all dispersed, living in very dire conditions. People, more than 100,000 have disappeared. When the prisons were opened, they haven't found all of the forcibly disappeared, tortured, repressed. So this is creating, of course, a legacy of violence and a legacy of revenge. The mechanism proposed here will be transitional justice mechanism, a la South Africa, possibly Rwanda, etc. And today's conference also established a committee for transitional justice. What does that mean in reality? How will that be implemented? The intention is there. However, HTS is also cautious about being also examined in terms of its own human rights records and practices, and it's not very eager to push towards that process, but it's been put on the agenda, and Syrians are very eager to account for the killings and the disappearances and the torture. Inclusive governance will also be crucial, and this is where a lot of the other items will be transitional justice. I mentioned the drafting of a constitution which will be inclusive of all different groups and communities within Syria. What type of norms? Will it be going back to the 1950 constitution, which is also saying that it's an Arab republic? What about the Kurds here and the non-Arabs within Syria? What about Islam as a reference? So all of these aspects will be negotiated in the next few years as a new constitution will be drafted. The Kurds, I mean, the autonomous region has boycotted that national dialogue conference. Actually, it was not invited by the central government because they said they will not invite military groups. They invited only civilians. This has created a rift in the sense that a lot of critiques were saying that the process is not entirely open, inclusive. What about the Alawis as well? Were they invited? And the way the National Dialogue Conference was also organized, it was organized in the last 2 days only. We knew since January that there was a preparation for this national conference. It kept being postponed until January, mid-February, later on. And the last 2 days, people got their invitation. Many of them were not able to attend. And it was seen as a very hasty process, maybe more performative, advisory type of process, in view of the transitional government, which will be appointed on Saturday. We can also look at it as a positive first step in gathering everyone, tackling very difficult, contentious issues such as the new army, the inclusion of all the military group, the constitution, transitional justice, etc. But then we have to see the 18 points declaration issued today, how it will be implemented in the next few years as the transition evolves. I can come back in the questions on the Kurdish autonomy and the sort of the committee that was established to put up the conference. Again, that goes back to the idea of a deep state. A lot of the appointees by Ahmad al-Sharia are HTS affiliates, loyalists. He's also appointing some foreigners who fought with him. So that's creating some distrust within the population. At the same time, I want to say he has a persona. He is the one who managed to overcome a very brutal regime. Nobody expected December 8th to happen. So he's also gaining this legitimacy, this popularity, which might allow him to get away for now in sort of self-appointing himself, appointing others, and possibly changing the institutions. However, what will be crucial here is the economic situation. More than 95% of Syrians live under the poverty line. And we're talking about dire economic conditions. And anybody who goes back to Damascus and to Syria will tell you people are tired, people struggle. The new rulers increased the wages by 400%, which is about $80 a month. And the average cost of living for a family of 4 or 5 is about $700 a month. So people are struggling. The cost of living is very high. The problem here is that the new rulers seem to take on more neoliberal type of orientation, economic orientation, which is being criticized by a lot of the activists. Intended privatization of major sectors, talking about foreign capital investment, a free market approach, which is encouraged. And the factories, ports, and foreign partnerships is being encouraged. There was a call today in the National Dialogue Conference to have public-private partnership. All of these measures were actually implemented by Bashar al-Assad himself in the last decade. So the critique is that they're following on that neoliberal trend versus trying to cater for the needs of the population, maybe having a dialogue with the trade unions, etc. Infrastructures and services, clearly the energy imports and the regional partnerships will be crucial here. And we know that the Turks and the Qataris are the ones investing, having agreements in terms of alleviating power shortages. That's a major issue in Syria, electricity, gas, and transport as well. The EU just lifted a few of the sanctions yesterday in those key sectors. So there's hope that possibly that would also alleviate the situation of the population. However, there's also a trend towards monopolies and patronage. A lot of the, for example, the oil minister and a telecom mogul are all HTS affiliated. So there's a fear that we're, again, perpetuating the monopolies that we've seen under the Assad era. And of course, in the context of sanctions, I mentioned the EU lifting. The Western world has been very reluctant to lift the sanctions. As we've seen, they always said they wanted to be conditional, although Syrians are saying we need the lifting of the sanctions to be able to develop. And if you don't want radicalism and extremism, we need to have a prosperous, country. So the EU has started that, maybe in view of the National Dialogue Conference. The US is still very reluctant, as we've seen in the US, talks about conditions being attached, etc. Russia is calling for the lifting of the sanctions, and Russia is playing a very ambiguous role here. It's in discussions with the new rulers, despite the fact that Russia was one of the, strongest ally of the Bashar al-Assad regime in past years. And Russia is very eager in keeping its naval bases in Syria. At the same time, Ahmad al-Sharia is asking for the return to Syria of Bashar al-Assad for trial and all of his surroundings in exchange for this maintenance of the bases and Russia's military role in Syria, which is still under discussion. From the economic perspective, I want to also mention a number that I read yesterday, which is shocking, that about 100,000 to 300,000 unexploded munitions remain in Syria, of course, posing threats to the population, children, etc. That will require a lot of money to dismantle as well in terms of the recovery. Finally, regional, am I over time? Very quickly, the regional and international relations, I want to listen also to Professor Khoury. The key alliances will be Damascus, Ankara, Riyadh, Doha. The first visit to Damascus was by the Qatari emir. That was a very symbolic visit, showing Qatar's investment in Syria and involvement as well. and also Sharia's call to the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia as well, and Turkey, versus Egypt, Jordan, UAE axis, which is reluctant to engage so far with the new regime. Of course, in terms of regional, as I mentioned, Israel's continued occupation, which will also pose a lot of pressure to the new regime. The relations with Russia and the US position will be very crucial in determining also the viability and security. I will end by saying the prospects of, and the future outlook, the need for inclusive governance, of course. Economic sustainability will be crucial here, but also diplomatic maneuvering and maneuvering between domestic and regional factors will be a challenge for the new regime. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Professor Nielsen, as well as to Ms. English, and for all the co-sponsors of this event here tonight. And thank you all for being here with us to discuss this crucial topic. I'm going to do a bit of more of a retrospective on what has been happening in Syria throughout the conflict that can help us think through some of the challenges ahead that Professor Daoudy has so comprehensively laid out. This past summer, in June 2024, I was in southern Turkey interviewing Syrians about their resilience or vulnerability after a decade of displacement and about their political belonging or lack thereof. Tonight I'm going to share some of my conversation with one of them, Ahmed. His story represents the journey of Syria's civil actors that I've researched over the last decade. And through it, we may observe the depths of the persecution and suffering of civilians and refugees since 2011, as well as their own responses to them. This is the hardest question you can ask, Ahmed replies to me. He proceeded to cry. My question had been, do you have a country? We take deep breaths. Ahmed, older than his 32 years, gathers himself. My country is Syria. I love it, but I don't think of returning. A profound sense of loss pervaded my visit. The conflict in Syria had reached something of a stalemate. Territory still divided, but the regime victorious. Most Syrian refugees did not think they could go back home. As Ahmed explains, I wished to return. We didn't want to leave. The regime forced us to. That would be the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who in 2000 inherited Syria from his father, Hafez, who had ruled since 1970. Ahmed was forced to flee because of insecurity in a country that experienced a war that took the lives of hundreds of thousands, forced millions from their homes, and created enormous humanitarian needs as it destroyed and deprived a people and a land. As is the case for most refugees, Ahmed was also forced to flee, not only because of generalized indirect threats, but for more particular political reasons. He had marched in protests during the 2011 Syrian uprising, part of a wave of Arab Spring movements across the region. He had remained in Syria as that nonviolent uprising met with regime repression, escalated into armed conflict. His town, outside the capital of Damascus, came under rebel control, and yet Ahmed didn't flee to government-held territory, a marker of disloyalty in the regime's ledger. And there he worked as a first responder, driving an ambulance for hospitals that had gone underground to avoid shelling. Indeed, even as needs inside the country surged, it was Syrians themselves who were delivering the vast majority of emergency relief in their country. My research shows that civil actors also advocated for detainee rights, documented daily events, distributed public goods, and on. I learned of their efforts through months of interview-based fieldwork in neighboring countries, after which I created a data set of public Facebook pages that Syrians set up to represent their organizing efforts. I found hundreds of civil organizations operating inside Syria. In analyzing the text of millions of posts from these pages, co-author Alex Siegel and I found that they persisted in so doing even in the depths of the war. And though Ahmad's was humanitarian action, his undertakings were another mark against him. The Syrian regime, according to Physicians for Human Rights, branded health workers as enemies of the state. Indeed, Syria became one of the deadliest places for aid workers in the world, according to another INGO. By 2015, the constraints and risks were becoming more than Ahmad could bear. Syrian pro-government forces were imposing a years-long siege on his town, characterized, as the UN described it, by near daily bombardments and extreme deprivations. The area had also become a militarized rebel stronghold presided over by a severe and organized Islamist armed group. Yet under these circumstances, civilians in the area still participated in nonviolent action, including a host of civil society projects, as well as healthcare and humanitarianism. A dedicated case study of the area in my forthcoming book finds that they did so partially as an extension of rebel governance, but also separately from armed groups and with quiet support from the international aid response. At the same time, many activists were detained or worse, including by the ruling rebels who Ahmad came to resent. Through a series of smugglers, he said indefinite goodbyes to his parents and made his way north through rebel-held territory. He was skipping out on military conscription by the regime, another marker that closed his country off to him. He passed through Idlib, where other Islamist rebels were replacing the moderate but disorganized Free Syrian Army and beginning to build an administrative and ideological counter-state. And eventually, like 3 million other Syrians, Ahmad made it to Turkey. 3 million more would take refuge in Lebanon, Jordan, and further afield. I met Ahmad 2 years later in 2017. He had continued his work in emergency response, but this time from across borders as staff for an international NGO providing aid through cross-border operations coordinated by the UN. A couple of years later, he began working for a Syrian NGO providing educational support to children inside Idlib, the Northwest government run by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The regime in Damascus had, from the start of the conflict, politicized and blocked aid from reaching opposition strongholds. In response, many international organizations found ways to work from across the Turkish and Jordanian borders. But they wouldn't assume the risks of implementing inside, nor did they enjoy the necessary knowledge, connections, and access. For that, as my projects show, they relied on the labor of Syrians. Indeed, a veritable population of Syrian NGOs and nonviolent activists emerged during this period, something like a civil society from where there never was one and against the odds of a brutal war. As our text analysis of the Facebook post demonstrates about the goals of civil organizers, we find that they focused not only on basic concerns of protection and survival, but also on more far-ranging issues such as governance and revolutionary politics. They built community centers to counter violent extremism, offered psychosocial support to children, prepared transitional justice processes for a day that seemed ever more improbable, advocated for their own human rights, and directed workshops for women's empowerment. In tracing the locations of hundreds of these Syrian organizations to Turkey, we confirm the qualitative research of my book that explores a whole social, professional milieu of activists in Turkey, of which Ahmed was a part, managing programs for their counterparts in the field inside. He met his wife, who was working on public health and hygiene in internal displacement camps in northwest Syria, in this milieu. They made the best of friends in these post-uprising circles in displacement. But it was not home. Restrictions on Ahmed's mobility meant he could not leave his Turkish province. His permit to work was always at risk. Stories of forced deportation haunted Syrian men in particular, as the once hospitable country increasingly scapegoated Syrians for myriad domestic woes. Everyday resentments would burst into anti-refugee riots just weeks after my visit in summer 2024. Ahmed would keep trying for Europe. He enumerates the visas for which he's applied already. But we both know the continent has become an impenetrable fortress ever since the 2015 refugee crisis and subsequent backlash against asylum that has tainted Western politics since. Ahmed is haunted by nostalgia as he tries to identify for me to what country he belongs. He goes on about festive Ramadan gatherings, about the large and loving extended family that surrounded him in childhood. He despairs to deprive his son of such an upbringing. Maybe one day, he says, in the future, if the regime falls, if there's a new government in Syria, a free country like we want, I will return. Today, Ahmed is planning just that. He has already joyfully gone once to scope out conditions for his family of 3. He had been in daily touch all these years, but only upon seeing with his own eyes did he appreciate how poor conditions had become for his parents and for a whole country that was exhausted. I don't know how people have been living, he reflected in voice messages to me. No fuel, no electricity, extreme poverty. The Assad dynasty's control penetrated deeply the lives of all Syrians. Their schooling, work, public and private life, immobility and exile, the very fabric of their psyches. Only once that control crumbled did its vulnerability become apparent, underneath a fierce but brittle facade. A regime enriched as a country de-developed, survived as sanctions impoverished, normalized abroad while hostile at home. A regime reliant on Russia, Iran, and Lebanon's Hezbollah while each fought its own battles, and Israel's military assaults reshaped the order of the Middle East region. The rebels, meanwhile, were becoming ever more organized in their little corner of the country. But their path forward is fraught in the country at large. The challenges include divisions along lines of control, ethnicity, and region that risk exploitation by spoilers of the old regime, aggravation by the genuine fears among minorities, and exacerbation by geopolitical rivalries and interventions. To bring a host of rebel groups, including Kurdish-led forces controlling a vast swath of the Northeast, into one national military and political project. To do so in an authoritarian region while around the world democracy slides back. If Syria's new authorities, as signs begin to suggest, resort to mere majoritarianism and fail to uphold individual protections and rights, or if they mimic an overly centralized executive government, the country could quickly fall in line with these anti-democratic trends. And millions of refugees risk losing protection in their host countries while conditions for voluntary return remain uncertain. Civil society cannot overcome all of these obstacles. But the assets of the wartime civil society that I have here described, the perseverance and experience of those nonviolent actors, hold some of the greatest potential for mitigating them. It is people like Ahmed, who never ceased acting on behalf of the Syrian cause, transformed as it was over the years, in whom I hold hope. As Wendy Perlman and I argue in forthcoming work, wherever opposition forces held sway during the war, civil organizers made life more livable and strived for rights and protection. When rebel-held areas began to shrink in 2017, the Assad regime pushed civil actors out, rejecting their know-how and dedication. But international actors and non-state armed groups, including even Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, knew better. In Idlib, for instance, HTS enabled civilian roles in governance, healthcare, and education. During the COVID pandemic, civil actors led the response there to ease the medical effects of the crisis, educate children remotely, and to raise awareness amid misinformation. And in 2003, in the aftermath of Turkey-Syria borderland earthquakes, Syria's civil actors, themselves victims, again led the response, adapting their expertise in man-made disaster to address a natural one. They did so alone without international or national support as the regime in Damascus relinquished responsibility for their plight. Today, there is an epic new challenge, but it need not be exceptional. In other post-conflict contexts like Liberia, Nepal, and Iraq, civil society activists have influenced the adoption and implementation of rights-based laws, pursued post-war demands through democratic processes, and mobilized protests to hold authorities to account. In Syria, what was something like a civil society during the war, dispersed as it was abroad and squeezed into rebel-held areas at home, stands the chance today to be a genuine civil society for the whole country. They can hold power to account, advocate for inclusivity, articulate grassroots demands, and mobilize the masses as necessary. They can help address issues of transitional justice, reconstruction and development, and representative institution building. And they can help serve the immense material needs that might otherwise undermine stability. These Syrians have mobilized under challenging conditions for years. They do have a country, and now their country can have them too. Thank you.
Thank you both. That was incredible. I could listen to you both talk about Syria for another hour each. I am. So I'll ask a few questions. Be ready with yours, though. Following up on the point that you just ended on, Rana, if I may, how are ordinary Syrians feeling now? It reminds me of a moment that I saw firsthand in May 2011, Cairo, where people were very poor, the state quite absent in a lot of ways, riding on hope, enthusiasm, and civil society. What do you see as the path forward to help civil society networks keep providing that infrastructure, given that, if I'm intuiting correctly, the government has many problems and probably can't immediately provide all of the services that we expect governments to? In a different international milieu, I might say this would be a chance for foreign aid to have a big impact. I'm not so sure that those sources of foreign aid are as available, although I'm focusing on the US here, and maybe the Europeans, Chinese, or others have a different view of what it is going to look like. But I'm curious for your thoughts, both of you, on the mood, how to keep the mood going, and what that civil society needs to be successful.
Sure. So I won't dare try to speak to how Syrians at large are feeling. They are, of course, of many feelings. But I do think that amongst many, no matter their sort of political orientation, hope is desperately felt. This country has been through the worst for the last 14 years. And even those sort of maybe, let's say, more liberal or secular sort of parts of society recognize the importance of this transition succeeding, because the costs of it failing are extremely high. We know in political science, one of the best predictors of civil war is having had a civil war already. And so I do think that there is a strong will for success, despite the apparent enormity of the challenges ahead. I think in terms of what, civil society, I'm not traditionally a civil society enthusiast. I know that for civil society to sort of have a productive role in a country, we also need a strong political system. We need an inclusive political system. But I think even if we look for some signals, the fact that we know all of these challenges and these minute-by-minute developments that Professor Daoudy has laid out is because of these independent media organizations. It is because of the organizations that have been abroad, that have been flocking into the country to be part of this transition. And so I do see signals there that this isn't impossible. The international milieu is backsliding. It is cutting aid. I have, in my work, acknowledged the ways that aid has been both helpful and hurtful to civil society activists and able to unconstrain them. And I do regret that this is a fragile moment for such an enormous sort of destruction of the US aid system, no matter its flaws. But I have faith that Syrians have learned to operate in the face of challenges, nevertheless.
Thank you.
So I think clearly the news that we get from people who are there, who have been through the last 13, 14 years, is a sense of great joy and relief, and at the same time struggle. Like they are struggling because the situation is difficult. It's difficult to find food, it's difficult to have electricity, the internet cuts off all the time. So all of these challenges are happening. They didn't happen since December, they were there before. And there's also, excuse me, a feeling of celebration. If you look at the weddings that are happening, it's all about the revolution songs, which are being sung and openly, which is like a major development for Syrians.
Please.
I want to say in terms of civil society adaptation and excuse me, resilience, the networks are meeting now. The Northwest used to be very active. I'm sorry.
Please take a moment as you need.
I have a cough. Oh, the microphone.
Do you need to turn the microphone on?
Well, I think it just needs.
I put it off, sorry. I put it back. I want to say the civil society is getting reorganized, meeting each other. Rana mentioned, excuse me, how active they were despite the authoritarian, the repression. In Northwest, at the time of the earthquake, excuse me, we saw how well adapted and resilient they were with cross-border aid, with regional international actors. The diaspora is getting involved now. We talked about the politicization of aid, how problematic it is, foreign aid. So there's been appeal to the Syrian diaspora to sort of reinvest in the country. So I think there's hope for civil society. Everybody who goes back, I had a webinar 2 weeks ago with Yassin Haj Saleh, who was live from Damascus. And he went around and he was saying he felt that everybody was able to express their thoughts and everything, and that's already a major development, I think.
Yeah. No, on this point about the Syrian diaspora reinvesting, I'll have to think more about that. That's a remarkable and really positive feeling. I guess kind of building off of where that point takes me, we mentioned and have seen these videos of refugees flowing across the Lebanese border back into Syria towards Damascus. But you were very stark about the number of refugees that are still overseas. My understanding is that many of the countries hosting those refugees are eager, perhaps too eager, for them to return. And so my dual question is, what do you think that those refugees are looking at in terms of domestic politics or other factors in Syria to say, okay, I'll take an exploratory trip, like you mentioned, to see how it is, or I will go back. Like, what are the markers for them? And then on the flip side, to the host governments, what would you tell them about the constraints that Syrians face in going back? Because you can see how it's conveniently a narrative for them to say, hey, there's no limit now on you returning, but that's politically useful at home. Depending on how your throat is feeling, I would have started with you, but let me know.
Thank you. I was quite shocked by the hastiness with which the European governments and countries have really encouraged, I'm being very diplomatic here, the Syrians to go back home on the 9th of December. I mean, it started off the few days after, the fall of the Assad regime. And knowing that, one has to realize the houses have been destroyed. A lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed. Even I have friends who went back to Damascus. They don't have a house. They say the hotels cost a lot. So even for foreigners with Canadian, American dollars, etc., it's very costly to go back. So imagine a refugee living in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley. I did my field work there. They live in a lot of precarity and very dire situation. They have no prospects. And when I called them, some of them, I said, are you happy? Are you going back home? They said, no, because we don't know what is awaiting us. Economically, they're not worried about the security situation as much as they used to be. But economically, we don't have any options. We have no house left, etc. So all of that is adding up to the anxiety, despite the potential hope and joy of returning. And one has to emphasize also, nobody wants to stay a refugee. And there's this assumption also in Europe that people desperately prefer to stay in Europe versus going back to Syria. They go back to Syria, they restore their dignity, they live in their homeland. They don't want to be treated like, especially we have those populist governments being elected, Germany and elsewhere, who focus on immigrants and the Syrians more specifically and the Muslims. So in that sense, their choice is to go back, their preferences. What are the alternatives? It's not clear now, but it's been only 2 months, one has to say, and already 500,000, according to the UNHCR, have been back from neighboring countries.
It's a good point about capacity. I had wondered this, but didn't have the source. It's just the amount of infrastructure damage. I mean, the al-Assad regime was dropping, for those of you who weren't keeping track, barrel bombs on cities and towns throughout Syria for an unthinkably long amount of time. Do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'll add a few things to that. One is, I think that if we look at the situation of refugees, there were political and now there are economic barriers to return. But fundamentally, the refuge was a political issue. I didn't turn it off, but it's still on.
Depends on how you turn your head.
Depends how I turn. Oh, you're right. Okay. I will stay very, very still. So in terms of what we can maybe think of how the host governments might sort of treat return without pushing or forcing people to leave quickly, is that especially in neighboring countries, at present, as last I checked, things are changing on a daily basis. Jordan is not allowing people to conduct go-and-see visits. And so it's dhihab duna auda, right? You can leave, but don't come back. And that is just far too high of the stakes for people to make this enormous decision in their life. So this is a very simple fix to allow for go-and-see visits, which is a very typical process that the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, uses. There's also sort of everyday quotidian concerns that maybe we don't think about. But for many people with young children, this happened in the middle of a school year. And if you think about the millions of Syrian children in Turkish schools who have never even been in an Arabic-speaking school, making this kind of decision on the turn of the dime is also very difficult. So I do think that as summer approaches, we will see sort of higher numbers. That said, I do think that even for people who might enjoy dignity in their homeland, for people in Europe who truly got a second chance at life and who are now enjoying stability, I think it's less likely that we'll see large numbers return, but it is in the neighboring countries most of all, and internally displaced people who constitute a large portion of the displaced population in the first place.
They might be part of the diaspora who will be investing back in Syria, coming back and forth, possibly, yes.
Yes.
And as a parent to school children, you made me realize this is the causal variable. No, it's. Yeah, I think as soon as you said it, I was like, you were right, that I should expect these seasonal surges based on, just the number of school child hours that has been disrupted by this conflict is like.
Destruction of schools.
And just the like, yeah. I also would keep my kids in a school if they were in one till the end of the school year. You mentioned Jordan, and that has me thinking about President Trump trying to place pressure on the Jordanians to take Gazans. So far, I have not heard the Trump administration talk about Syria hardly at all. That doesn't mean they're not doing things. They carried out strikes strikes happened in the country, under the old administration immediately after the fall of the regime. And I believe that some operations are ongoing, although not keeping up. When you said that Ahmed al-Shara has this problem of how to criticize occupation of Syrian territory by Israel, how does the current US political uncertainty intersect with that? On one hand, it seems to me that trying to avoid being target of focus seems like a wise thing for a government to do, given the current environment. But I may not be perceiving that correctly, and with the new administration, many previously unthinkable possibilities are now forced upon us to be thinkable. One that I have for you is, imagine that the Trump administration came to the Syrians and said, great, we'll help you out if you sign on to Abraham Accords. Mm-hmm. How should we think about this complex network of international relations vis-a-vis what's happening domestically? You're both like, you first.
That's a very good point, Rich. I think, interestingly, Ahmed al-Shara, he reached out to all of the international actors, including the US. But when President Trump made that statement about transferring Palestinians from Gaza to neighboring countries and having a Riviera, whatever, that very fancy scenario for Gaza, he did an interview a few days afterwards where he said that is not acceptable as a solution. And one has to look at his background. He's traditionally a pro-Palestinian fighter as well. Like initially when he entered into military struggle and went to Iraq actually to fight against American presence in Iraq, he was also having a pro-Palestine agenda, and he made statements about that. It took him a while to talk about Israel's occupation, and the understanding here was that he was trying to manage, the two levels. But he did do a statement recently, and again, I want to outline the fact that he has to cater to a constituency, which is, for the Syrian population, the Palestinian cause is very important. And they've been watching with horror what is happening in Gaza. So he cannot have a statement or not take a position. And actually, Syrians were criticizing him for being silent until now. So he had to take a position at some point. At the same time, he has to manage, he wants the US sanctions to be lifted. He wants the banking system to be restored. He wants people to be able to invest in Syria, etc. And so he cannot antagonize the US. I have no hope that the US will invest in Syria without strings attached. And the Abraham Accords, which have been signed by other Arab countries such as Morocco, the UAE, and others, Bahrain, might be on the table. I don't envisage it as something that the new rulers would be on board, considering the population and considering Syria's history. But we'll have to see how the relation will be managed.
Yeah, thanks. You do not have to say anything.
Trump, the elephant in every room. So just to put a little bit of, let's say, historic context, traditionally Syria has been called what's sometimes referred to as part of the axis of resistance, resisting Israel and the US in the region. And so when December 8th and what preceded began, for some people, this was sort of proof of concept that this was an Israeli or an American plan to weaken the axis of resistance. I think since then we can sort of see very clearly that Israel is also opposed to this Syrian regime and frankly to sort of any democratic opening in Syria, because as Professor Daoudy laid out, Syrians are sort of all very pro-Palestinian. And so I think this is a very difficult situation for the new authorities. They are between a rock and a hard place, or between Iraq and Israel. They both cannot lose the domestic legitimacy, and they do not have the capacity to put off Israeli assaults.
I've abused my time as chair, but we did get that delightful pun at the end. Now's the time for you to ask questions. Please come forward to the microphones, line up. I'll alternate sides. I don't know most of you, but I do happen to know the gentleman right here at the front, so I'll say welcome back, Roger Peterson.
Thanks, Rich. This is a question for both panelists about transitional justice. You're not the first case of transitional justice. Some of us have worked on this in other areas. I was down in Colombia working on this, and Evan Lieberman, I don't know if Evan's in here yet, but he worked in South Africa. So the three terms in transitional justice that are usually talked about are truth, justice, and reparations. And you have a truth commission, what actually happened. You have justice, which is somebody's got to be punished. And this was the issue in Colombia. Before they had amnesties, they said no more amnesties. Somebody has to be punished. That's justice. And then reparations. But when I'm thinking about Syria, I know it's very early, but a lot of this doesn't seem applicable to Syria. I mean, there's so many people to have reparations. I mean, it's not like a specific group went after a specific people. It's like everybody is a victim in some way almost here. Truth, do you really want to have a big narrative about what the HTS was doing and as an Al-Qaeda affiliate? Justice, do you really want to bring in vengeance into this? So I know you probably have awareness, maybe even teach about transitional justice generally. What are we learning from other cases and our knowledge as academics on transitional justice, if anything, and how much is this going to be applied to this case? How much is Syria going to be a unique case? Thanks.
Whichever order you prefer.
Okay. The other term that I hear about transitional justice is reconciliation when you think about South Africa. In the case, why not in Syria? I do believe there's the capacity to go through justice, accountability. There's been isolated incidents. People were executed. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights accounted for about 130 executions. And these were people who were targeted, who were seen as having committed massacres and torture or in prison, etc. It could have, I mean, I'm amazed that we didn't see more of these incidents. I would have expected like a lot of executions happening. So there's somehow maybe a willingness to turn a certain page, at the same time having accountability. So I think if we have truth commissions, learning from South Africa, I don't know, when I read some reports about South Africa, who would have thought after such a horrible, brutal regime as the apartheid regime to have the possibility of having national unity, people coming forth? Why not in Syria? I think people are ready for it. Somehow they've shown a lot of maturity in dealing with the past, but also confronting the future and wanting a prosperous, peaceful future. It has to be done with the right mechanisms, and it has to be done also accountability, not execution, right? Like there was an incident recently, a person who was known to have committed the Tadamun massacre, who was arrested, but then he was freed. And some say he was appointed also in some capacity. That is a problem, because for the families, this is not justice. So the new rulers will have to strike a balance about being just, being fair, having accountability, but also preventing, you know, when Bashar al-Assad left, his brother also left with him sometime afterwards. He started pouring money to his loyalists who were back in Syria to say, I will give a reward to anyone who manages to, you know, have a collapse of the new regime, etc. So there's an effort to counter the new regime, which is real on the ground with military people, you know. So maybe at some point the truth and reconciliation and reparation will happen. I would see first a consolidation of peace and security, and then we can talk about this transition. But I have hope for that, yes.
For the sake of time, if you're comfortable, I'll take the next question. Sir.
You mentioned the use of Facebook and the internet. Could you talk more about the communications and media landscape?
Sure. Syria did not have independent international media inside the country, in government-held territory in particular throughout the war. In this time period, starting with 2011, Syrian activists took to Facebook to communicate, to organize, to coordinate dissent actions in the streets. And they also sort of picked up on providing that media coverage, getting the message out of what was happening inside Syria of their own accord, and corresponding with international outlets, and then over the years eventually setting up their own media organizations, and both in rebel-held territory as well as abroad. And so, you know, I think we are seeing that sort of come back and cover what's happening throughout the country right now. But I do want to say, just like as we are familiar with in the US context, there's also a sort of atmosphere that's rife with misinformation, disinformation. You know, any given TikTok video can suggest certain things that are happening on the ground that are sort of exaggerated or so forth. And so in a way, we have this overload of media narratives that I think we can all understand in the US context as well. So I do think the professionalization of the media during the opposition media during the war is a very important asset right now, but sort of being able to communicate facts and truth are a challenge.
Ma'am, on this side.
I wanted to congratulate the panelists. Your two different perspectives and style really complement each other very, very well, and it was an excellent presentation. My One question has to do with Syria as a narco state and Captagon. Is Syria a producer of Captagon or also a consumer of Captagon? And how has that business model changed, and what do you see in the future?
Okay. I forgot to mention in my presentation that one of the conditions put by the new administration was also the end of the Captagon and all of this economy which was based on it. And you know, Syria is exporting it to the Gulf, to the region. We saw also the destruction of the factories. I don't know if you saw the pictures, like how much had been produced under the Bashar al-Assad regime. And you know, with the sanctions and the end of the yields from Lebanon and etc., that became a very big source of revenue for the regime. I believe the new rulers are focusing on destroying that economy. The problem, this economy was also born as a war economy, as having predators, war predators, you know, enriching themselves through the war, the destruction, finding parallel channels of economy. In my view, it will take time to destroy all of that and to prevent new lords from taking advantage of the situation. I don't think from the readings and everything what I hear that the new rulers are investing in that or continuing that. And it will be in their interest to show a new image also and have new investments poured into Syria, and that is often the condition that is put by foreign investors. Are they consumers? I believe the Captagon is expensive, and I don't know if there's a capacity for Syrians to really have the capacity to buy that drug. What I've heard is that it's a lot exported to the Gulf states. And that's also a condition put by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and others to stop that trade.
Thanks for those insights. On this side, I'm going to embarrass Dr. Elizabeth Parker-Magyar, who is an MIT alum.
Okay, so I guess my question will also be directed to Professor Daoudy if we had to choose one. In your talk, you discussed a lot these like ideas, inclusivity, conciliation. And you didn't say the word like democracy or elections. And I recently, you know, this speech by Ahmed Ashara recently, he got a lot of attention for saying we will hold elections. Mm-hmm. The social science literature tends to say that in a democratic transition, it is better to delay, right? It's better to wait as long as possible. At the same time, there is concern that he might consolidate power, right? How should we think about this idea of whether or not Syria should even hold out elections as a future goal, as a future guidepost, versus like rushing them or pressuring them too much?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't use the word democracy because it's void of, I mean, it's been overused. I'm not saying I'm not for democracy. I want to specify that. But I mean, everybody has been analyzing Iraq from a democratic perspective. What did it lead to? We had civil war, we had destruction, we had American occupation. Clearly, the objective for Syria will be to lead to an inclusive democratic system. I think elections are on the table within a few years, not immediately. And you're right to say maybe you need to consolidate. It's a post-conflict era. Syrian activists, the population will expect to have a new system implemented. But I want to say that everything is intertwined. The drafting of the constitution will determine what type of regime there will be. Will it be presidential? Will it be parliamentarian? What type of democracy will we have? Who will be represented? Who will be included? And clearly, the objective will be to lead to that. But I see it as steps, you know, inclusivity now, consolidation of peace, security, inclusion of all the voices, civil, military as well, and then we'll talk about elections, etc. However, the risk is that clearly HTS and the new rulers will consolidate power, and then it will be too hard to go back and to have a new system. I don't think it's in his interest because he will create a backlash not only domestically but also internationally.
Anything you want to add, Rana?
I mean, just quickly, you know, although these questions are very open and it is a step-by-step process, Ahmed Ashara has already indicated 2 very preemptive decisions that he's made on his own absent those national dialogues and inclusive institution building, which is one, he's already referred to it as a presidential system. And he's already sort of ruled out federalism as a potential solution to some of the issues over regional, territorial, and ethnic control. And so, unfortunately, I think he's really jumped the gun on two of the biggest questions in the political process.
A presidential system in the transition period, right? Like, this was my understanding of his statement, that in the meantime, he's self-appointed like as president of Syria, but then the constitution should determine somehow once it's drafted, but it might be drafted as a presidential system. But there were talks that it might be parliamentarian. Syria used to be a parliamentarian democracy in the 1940s, before a CIA coup in 1949, which toppled it and ended the democracy. So somehow for the Syrians, that would still need to be discussed and negotiated. If you agree with me, or what do you think? Or do you think it's like been established?
I mean, I thought he referred to presidential elections in 4 years. Like in,
okay. We'll see.
But I could be wrong.
It'll be interesting. No, I mean, I'll be interested to see how this unfolds.
I will say this is indicative of the difficulty of keeping up with what's happening.
Thank you so much, both Professor Khoury and Daoudy. As an Iraqi, there's so much I'd want to ask, but let's keep it about Syria. And I was wondering, do you foresee any tension between the diaspora and the locals? Like in Iraq, we saw a lot of tension between, those who grew up in Iraq, had to live in exile during Ba'athism and returned. And then we're seeing a new wave of those that, their children that grew up entirely in the West and going back. There's that tension between, and Syria is going to go through that. Has civil society spoken about, how they're going to handle that, and how's that relation going? Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I would also like to hear all the lessons from Iraq. We had this tension, particularly, I think, in 2011, at the time of the uprising, where people in the diaspora were sort of speaking on behalf of the Syrian cause in ways that were at a distance from the grassroots on the ground. I think the course of the war sort of rendered them irrelevant, or much less relevant, let's say, as this became a different sort of beast. And I think people now sort of are, in a way, deferring to more what has happened inside the country, right? They're saying things like, Ali bihadir biqadr, right? Like, he who liberates decides. They know that this was a military victory by a rebel group. That said, I think that their participation and their voices do matter, also precisely now for those reasons, right? We don't want this just to be a military-led process. And even in the ways that they have sort of included a couple of the members of the political diaspora in the preparatory committee for this national dialogue, right? So they are being brought in. But we were just speaking about this before the talk. I mean, diaspora politics often has what people call like a sort of stuck in time, right? That the politics that they bring with them is an old politics and not the new. So I do believe there will be those tensions. But I also think that people much closer to Syria, including those sort of civil organizers just across the borders in places like Turkey, are going to be the most involved.
Can I just add that I had a discussion with a researcher who was working on the Syrian community in Brazil, and all of those who had migrated in the 19th century, 20th century descendants were very pro-Assad. They had to romanticize Syria and kept, and the younger generation, I think there's a generational rift here. We've seen it. We even see it in the Jolan. Interestingly, the younger generation has taken sides with the revolution, the older generation with the regime. And I think now those who are discontented with the change eventually will also want to go back to Syria. So why not in that sense?
Great. Before the next question, I will just flag that we do end at 6. And so I'll ask you to keep the questions tight if possible so we can get through as many of them. And then when we hit 6, I'll close the event wherever we're at. Please.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you can comment on the religious landscape of the current leadership, especially given previous affiliations with Al-Qaeda and like worries about rise of like trending towards Muslim extremism like in the future?
Do you want me to answer? HTS is a Sunni group, clearly. Al-Qaeda was about fighting against the Assad regime, but it had a very strong religious component and identity, clearly. However, interestingly, when HTS, the Salvation Government, was managing Idlib, northwest Idlib, it had this Islamic and I would say radical identity in terms of local life, etc. Despite that, the reports that we had, and I talked to a lot of activists who used to go on a regular basis to Idlib and the region, the management, the political management was very pragmatic. It was not on the basis of one's religious allegiance, etc. It was on a technocratic ground. So there's hope that now this sort of experience will be transposed to managing the country. But clearly, and this is why there's also an Arab identity, but also you have foreign fighters who have helped HTS who are not Arabs, who have been integrated in it. So there's a hope that possibly beyond the Arab identity, there will be an inclusion, but a lot of the other communities, the Alawis, the Druze, the Christians will say they worry about that Sunni focus, although the preparatory committee had a Christian woman appointed. We don't know if it's cosmetic, if it's like really, so there's an attempt to talk also to the different communities.
Well, first of all, thank you for both Professors Daoudy and Professor Khoury. I had two questions, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to ask one. My question has to do with last point Professor Daoudy mentioned, which is appointing people like HTS, appointing people, and especially allies to the government, especially in critical positions. Do you think this is a good strategy from the from the new government in an attempt to try to avoid the Egyptian scenario in 2011, when the state, the revolution, superficially succeeded, but then the deep state doubled this revolution?
There's a Jordanian national who was appointed in a very critical security position. He's on the list of terrorists in Jordan, so that's creating sort of a rift with the Jordan as a neighbor. There are also Uzbeks who have been, contributing, also working with HTS. I feel this is more of a strategic move to reward them. We know that the new rulers have also established that the Uyghur will have free education in Syria because they're being repressed in China, and we have Uyghur fighters as well. So if we're talking about the foreigners who are being integrated, it's a controversial decision. A lot of Syrians don't like the idea of having those people integrated, having political positions or security positions. Others would say it's a strategic move to prevent possibly, countering or feeling that there's no reward after their contribution to the success of the battle. In the long term, I think they will have to integrate, if they stay in Syria, and integrate in a system which is not HTS. It will have to be a national institutions, and we will see how will that work out. We know that some of these fighters are very radical. They ask women to to cover themselves. Those who do not cover themselves automatically, will they respect also the fact that there are different communities in Syria, different ways of life, and they will need to integrate, and that will be the challenge, I think, in the future.
Sir.
Hello. Can you guys comment on the role Turkey can play, like in having a constructive role in shaping the future Syria?
Go ahead.
So I think one way to look at the Turkish role is, as Professor Daoudy pointed out in her remarks, Turkey's support was certainly useful in getting Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as far as it went. That said, I think Turkey, in a way, is more behind in their past than necessarily in their future. At this point, I think the new authorities have their pickings of international support, and it's not solely reliant on the Turks anymore, right? And we saw, for example, the first international trip taken by the president was to Saudi Arabia, and only second was Turkey. So I do see them sort of playing the field in a way. But certainly Turkey, I think they give themselves a lot of credit for their support for the Syrian opposition. And they already have economically highly influenced the northwest region where the rebels were operating. They were using Turkish currency in those regions. They were connected to Turkish cell phone companies, Turkish internet services. The sort of governors of the provinces on the borders were in charge of administering some of the areas in the northwest. And so their involvement is very deep. And I think they see sort of opportunities for trade in ways that can be a little concerning right now, sort of flooding the market with Turkish goods. And but I do think like in a way, the world is more open to the new authorities and not. Yeah.
That brings us to our time. Join me in thanking our speakers.